Hello, beautiful best friends. Welcome back to our safe, cozy little space of the internet. Thank you so much for finding your way back here today so that we could hang out. I hope you're doing super well. And if no one's told you yet today, you are looking beautiful. You are smashing life in general. And I love you. If you have just randomly stumbled across this video, you've never been here before, then hi, my name is Liz. It is so lovely to meet you. And hopefully while you're here, my mic won't fall in front of my face. Can we just not do that? That would be great. Let's try that again. Hopefully while you're here, you'll find something that you like. We can get to know each other and bond, and then we'll just be best friends forever and ever and ever. Personally, that's just how I see this whole thing going, but there's no pressure whatsoever. Seeing how, as usual, I'm super prepared and I don't know exactly what day this video is going to be up, I just want to dive in and wish you all a huge happy holidays. And I hope no matter how you celebrate this season, it's filled with joy and love, and that you are able to spend it with those that you love most, even if it has to be over FaceTime. I hope it's still special. It's so hot right now. I am so jealous of anyone on the other side of the world that is enjoying a huge festive winter wonderland right now rather than the boiling heat we get at Christmas time in Australia. I know I've spent all of my 35 years of life here and I just still can't get used to it. And yeah, I did say 35. As I'm filming this right now, my birthday is tomorrow. So by the time you guys are watching this, I will have officially reached that halfway point between 30 and 40. And I'm not sure how to handle that either, but I'm sure it's going to be fine. Another princess who doesn't handle the heat very well is, of course, everyone's favorite emotional support angel, Lily, who, of course, will be joining us as usual today. So if you're new here and you hear weird noises in the background, it's not a ghost. It's most likely Lily panting up a storm, and she will pop her head up during this video, most likely to check in with us and let us know how much she is not okay with it being this hot. On a side note to turning 35, I just went and got extra piercings in my ears, other than just my earlobes, like a total teenager. And you might notice in this video that one of my ears is healing a bit slower than the other. I sleep on my side. There's just no avoiding that. I can't sleep on my back. It's impossible. So this ear that I tend to sleep on a lot is looking a little tiny bit like Rudolph's red nose right now. So that's fun. It looks so bad. Let's just do that. That fixes it. Kind of. So today we are going to be talking about the Christmas Day unsolved disappearance of Patty Vaughan in 1996. And if you guys are in the US and you are fans of the show Disappeared, you might have already heard of this one. It's an extremely frustrating case. I'll be honest, even though this is technically an unsolved case, there's not a whole lot of mystery here. In a lot of people's opinion, it's quite clear what became of Patty and even who was most likely involved. And yet today, 25 years later, Patty and her family are still left with no peace. So let's begin by going back in time to the night of Christmas Eve, 1996 in Lavernia, Texas. 32-year-old Patty Vaughan was celebrating with a big Christmas Eve dinner party at her aunt's house, and everyone was there. It was a full house, and all of her family members were so thrilled to see Patty so happy because that was kind of out of the ordinary for this time of year. This wasn't because Patty didn't like Christmas. If anything, it seemed to be the opposite. She sounded like a fellow Christmas fanatic, but sadly, it wasn't that unusual for her family to see her crying at these holiday gatherings, even though she would try and hide it. And this was, of course, something that always broke their hearts. But this year, things were different. Patty had gone through a rough time recently, particularly in the last few months, as she had separated from her husband of 11 years, the father of her 3 beautiful children. But despite that, she was was filled with joy and excitement. She had been a little bit nervous about this dinner because rather than having her husband with her, she had brought along her new boyfriend, Gary, a man that none of her family had met previously. And she was worried about what they would think, how they would greet him, all of the stuff that you worry about when introducing a new partner to your loved ones. And so Patty had been so relieved to find that all of that worry had been for nothing, because that night her family fully accepted Gary with big smiles and open arms. Like, honestly, how could they not, when they could see she was so clearly head over heels and so happy? Gary had bought her this beautiful necklace with this heart-shaped diamond pendant that Patty was proudly wearing around her neck, and they just had that delicious, fresh, new love glow around them, and everyone had a wonderful night. The dinner party went late because everyone was having such a great time, but eventually things wound up at about midnight and people started heading home, hugging goodbye and wishing each other a Merry Christmas. And none of them had any clue that this would be the last time that they would ever see Patty alive. Patricia Inez Brightwell, better known to her family and friends as Miss Patty, was born on the 17th of August 1964 to her parents Patsy Wallace and Billy Brightwell in Texas. And it sounds like she was the only child on the scene for quite a while before her younger sister Jeannie, who was over 15 years her junior, and their two younger brothers were born. Throughout Patty's life, the most important thing to her, other than her very close-knit family, was her faith. She was heavily devoted and involved in her church and had been raised in a religious household. Her sister Jeannie actually said in an interview that one of her earliest memories was their mum allowing Patty to date in her teens, but only if she brought along Jeannie and their younger brother with her, to make sure that there was like nothing questionable going on. Something that obviously would have been most teen girls' worst nightmare, but Jeannie said that Patty didn't even seem to mind. She was like their second mum. Growing up, Patty was very creative. She always had a gift for music and was voted most talented at her high school. Like, it sounds like she was one of those people I'm completely jealous of, that can just pick up any instrument and play it if they want to. But Patty was particularly gifted in guitar and she had a beautiful singing voice. So as well as being a staple member of the choir at her United Methodist Church, she also had her own Christian rock band called the Prism and Patty that would tour around and perform at different churches. As we said, Patty was allowed to date in her teens, but her family has said that as far as they know, Patty only had one serious boyfriend back then. They had met back in 1982 when Patty was still just 18, but she was just so in love and she was certain that she was going to marry this man. Spoiler alert, this man was Gary. Yeah, the new boyfriend that Patty had brought to the Christmas Eve dinner. They actually went way back. He was Patty's first love, but even though they were very serious and very into each other back then, months into their relationship, Gary's ex came forward and told him that she was pregnant with his child, and Gary made the very hard decision that the best thing to do, even though he was very much in love with Patty as well, was to break things off and marry his ex-girlfriend so that they could raise their child together. Patty was just completely heartbroken by this. She had pretty much planned her and Gary's whole life in her head, like you do when you're 18. And it took her a good long while to recover and feel ready to move on with someone else. And in 1985, when she was 21, she moved on by marrying a man named Jerry Ray Vaughan, who she met when he became a regular at the burger joint she was working at, and things eventually turned romantic. And so over the next 5 or so years, Patty and JR had 3 children, a girl named Brittany and 2 boys named Ray and Kyla, and they moved around a whole lot as they started their own family construction business, which grew to include a couple of other companies, and they ended up living all over the place, including Georgia, Maine, and Virginia. In 1990, though, the Vaughan family settled in Lavernia, Texas, which was a small city with a population of about 600 at the time, and it's about 25 miles miles east of San Antonio. JR had actually grown up in Lavernia, and his family were very well respected and connected in the community there. So it was great for the construction business because it meant by default he tended to get the contracts for any high schools that were being built in the area. So from the outside, just in photos and the image that the Vaughan family kept up, it seemed that they had the ideal life, you know, a happy marriage, 3 beautiful children, and a thriving business. But as is often the case, there were definitely some things in their lives that were less than perfect. In fact, over the years, Patty's family had developed some pretty serious concerns about Patty's relationship with JR. JR had always been controlling, like he had certain expectations, the main one being that he refused for Patty to be a working mum. He wanted her to stay at home with the kids, but this was fine with Patty because even though she was so musically talented, her true love in life was being a mum to those kids. She was an amazing mother and they were her entire world. But Patty's family's concerns extended beyond JR's controlling nature in the relationship. When I mentioned earlier that Patty would often be seen crying at Christmas, it was because for some reason JR would be particularly mean at that time of the year. Basically, every year Patty would host these huge Christmas gatherings for both her family and JR's, and every year JR would be in the background not helping but instead making snide remarks along the lines of telling Patty and the other female family members that they should all stay in the kitchen and focus on cooking because no one wanted to hear them gossiping and whatnot. Oh, hi. Yeah, he was mean, wasn't he? I know it's hot. I know. She is so unimpressed with the heat. You all right, Lil? Yeah, I know. JR sounded like a real swell guy. And personally, I think if it had been me, I would have given him like a slow clap. And then while he wasn't looking, I would have probably spat in his food. But Patty was a good person, and she took everything on board and was really sensitive to it, and this is why she was quite often upset at Christmas. Apparently JR's charm went beyond just being verbally mean though. One family member reported that once during a fight, JR threw a jar of mayonnaise across the room at Patty in a rage right in front of them, and more than one person had noticed suspicious bruises on Patty's body and said that when they asked her about them, she would just brush it off. Jeannie, Patty's younger sister, who we mentioned earlier, actually stayed with Patty and JR and the kids for a period of time during her high school years. And in that time, she witnessed a fair amount of arguments between the couple. And there's one particular instance she speaks about where she saw JR physically push Patty during an argument while she was holding their youngest child. And as a result, Patty ended up injuring her knee from the way she had to twist herself so that she didn't land on the baby when she fell. It seems like 96 was a year of big change for Patty though, and after over 11 years of being under JR's thumb, she was kind of determined to claim her life back. So against his wishes, after being a stay-at-home mum all of these years, now that her youngest was in full-time school, Patty entered back into the workforce, getting a job as a secretary at a local electric company called Quinney Electric. And it seems like this bold move by Patty caused a great deal of conflict because in October 1996, on Columbus weekend, just a couple of months before she went missing, Patty and JR had a big blowout that resulted in them parting ways and agreeing to a 6-month trial separation. During this separation, Patty stayed in the family home with their kids in Lavernia, and JR moved out to an apartment by himself in San Antonio. And in the months that followed, Patty's family saw this huge positive change in her. She was turning her life around after living by JR's rule all of this time. And when her loved ones commented saying, "You're doing so great," you know, she said she was doing it for her kids. She wanted them to live the best life possible. And the separation actually seemed pretty amicable from the outside. You know, JR had voluntarily agreed to move out of the house and into his apartment, but it appeared that Patty and JR had very different outcomes in mind for the split. JR seemed to view the whole split as very temporary and took to continually harassing Patty, especially at her work, calling multiple times a day and sometimes just turning up unannounced to have it out in person, which of course caused Patty a whole lot of embarrassment. And meanwhile, for Patty, this was kind of it. She was done. If anything, JR's behavior just made her more determined that things between them were over. And this is when she reconnected with Gary, who had also just been through his own divorce with his ex. So not only were they old flames, but they had a lot in common, going through these splits with their spouses and all of the complications that go along with that. But as happy as Patty was to rekindle this romance with Gary, Patty was terrified of the moment that JR would find out, and with good freaking reason, because even though she and Gary had only reconnected in the month before she disappeared, they had already gone through more than their fair share of bumps in the road. As I mentioned earlier, Patty was heavily involved and really loved her church, but things within her church community had definitely gotten a little bit rocky as a direct result of her relationship with Gary. Basically, in mid-December, December the 13th to be exact, a man from Patty's church had just innocently gone out for lunch at Dairy Queen and was horrified when in that very same restaurant he saw Miss Patty herself brazenly sitting there with not her husband, JR, but with a totally different man that he did not recognize. I mean, the horror, right? Now, Patty and JR, even though they made no secret of their separation, they were definitely keeping up appearances. They didn't want to rock the boat. So for the last couple of months, they had attended church together every week as a family, arriving in different cars, but walking into that building together. I'm pretty sure Patty was even still wearing her wedding band. So this man from Patty's church understandably felt personally attacked when he witnessed this romantic lunch meetup between Patty and this man that was not her husband. And so he went straight to the minister of the church and told him all about it. And apparently the minister agreed that this was totally out of line, because a couple of days later in music rehearsal, he approached Patty in front of all of the church members present and basically called her a harlot and said that she did not deserve to be on that stage representing her church. This left Patty obviously completely devastated and embarrassed, and even worse, a lot of the congregation assumed that Patty had started seeing Gary before she and JR had officially split, and people that she previously would have counted among her closest friends were now giving her the cold shoulder and freezing her out. To make matters even worse, it seems like this man that had ratted on Patty to the minister felt convicted enough to also reach out to JR, because JR found out about Gary right around the same time that all of this went down. And JR was, of course, ragey as hell, causing even more stress and chaos in Patty's life. But even with all of this drama going on, she was happy. Gary made her happy. You know, she saw a future with him. She was keen to move on with him, but obviously she still had her kids to think about. And so she and JR had decided that the best way for them to spend their first Christmas as a separated couple was as normal. This was already going to be a hard time for the kids, and Patty didn't want to make it any harder. So the plan was for JR to come over to the house on Christmas morning dressed as Santa, for them to be together as a family while they opened gifts, and then Patty was going to host JR's family for an early Christmas dinner that night. And she was anxious because she knew JR was going to want to have it out with her about Gary. In fact, Patty was so anxious that at that Christmas Eve dinner party at her aunt's, she had pulled one of her cousins aside and asked if she knew how to file a restraining order. And her cousin said no, she didn't, but they made plans to meet up between Christmas and New Year's to kind of hash it out and go through the process together. Oh, hi. Yeah, I know it's still hot. I swear Lily has lapdog envy, and if she could, she would sit in my lap the whole time that we hung out. Look at that pretty face. How are you so pretty? Hey? I have hair all over my desk now. And then it was Christmas Day. JR came over as planned in the morning, and the kids opened up all their presents. At about 10:30 a.m. that morning, Jeannie, Patty's sister, called from Georgia, where she and the rest of Patty's immediate family were living, to wish her sister a Merry Christmas. And Jeannie says that when she called the house phone, JR picked up. And so she wished her brother-in-law a Merry Christmas, told him that she loved him, and asked to speak with Patty. And when Patty came on the phone, she could immediately tell from her voice that she had been crying. When Jeannie asked Patty if she was okay and why she was upset, Patty brushed off her concerns and told her that she must just be coming down with a cold. And then later that day, when members of JR's family started turning up for the Christmas dinner that Patty was supposed to be hosting that night, JR turned them away one by one and told them the same thing. Patty wasn't feeling well and wouldn't come out of the bedroom. According to Patty's family, they feel that this would have been extremely out of character for her. They feel that if she had, in fact, been sick that day, she would have gone to the bathroom, splashed some water on her face, given herself a pep talk in the mirror, and then gone out there to face everyone and been the perfect hostess. No one would have even known that anything was wrong. But as far as JR was concerned, Christmas had essentially been called off. And when his sister turned up that night, he told her that again, Patty wouldn't come out of her room and asked her to take the kids so that he and Patty could once again hash it out and hopefully finally clear things up. This meant that Patty never dropped off the kids at her aunt's house as she had planned so that she and Gary could spend Christmas night together. She never called to cancel. She just never showed up. And I'd imagine that any other day, with how close-knit Patty's family seems to be, there would have been some alarm and panic a little bit earlier, but it was Christmas Day and her aunt just assumed that the dinner that she thought Patty was hosting for JR and his family had just gone longer than expected and they were all having a great time and she didn't want to interrupt. The following morning though, when Patty's family still hadn't heard from her and no one was answering the home phone when they called, they were officially on full alert and very worried. Her cousin actually tried to call and report Patty as missing that afternoon, but she was told that as Patty was a full-grown adult, she was entitled to come and go as she pleased and they would have to wait a full 72 hours before they filed a missing persons report. And then that night, this cousin got a very strange phone call from JR where he turned around and told her that Patty had been missing for the last 24 hours. And after not answering the family's phone calls all day, he was just calling to let them know now. He said that after he and Patty had fought on and off all of Christmas Day, Patty had finally had enough. And at about 6:30 p.m., she grabbed her purse and her keys, stormed out the front door to her blue Dodge minivan and just left, and he hadn't seen her since. JR said that he had just let her go, assuming that she had gone to see Gary. It wasn't until he got a phone call from her boss the next afternoon that he realized something was wrong. Patty never turned up for her rostered shift that morning, the day after Christmas, which was very unlike her to just not turn up without calling. And her boss had told JR that on his way back to the office after lunch at about 1:30 p.m., he had seen Patty's minivan on the side of the road, about 15 miles from her home and about a mile from the office. What was especially strange, though, was that the minivan had not been there that morning or even about an hour earlier when Patty's boss left the office to go to lunch. So when he saw it, he pulled over to check out what was going on, thinking maybe Patty was stranded and having engine troubles, but Patty was nowhere to be found. He did notice that the front driver's side tire was flat, and so this was when he called JR to tell him what was going on with the minivan and see what on earth was up with Patty. JR said that Patty's boss had taken the minivan to the office, and so now certain that something was definitely wrong, Patty's cousin and a couple of other family members went to check out the van. And the first thing that they noticed was that that van was way too clean. Patty used this van on a daily basis to tow around her 3 young children, all aged under 10. And yet there was not a single crumb or smudge of food, no snack wrappers or empty drink bottles to be found anywhere. It was spotless, even down to the carpet in the van, which was also meticulously clean and damp, like it had just been shampooed. The way JR made it sound on the phone was that he thought Patty had left in a huff the previous night to go and see Gary and then experienced a tire blowout. So she'd had to pull over, and then when she was stranded on the side of the road, some random person had pulled over to help her, but had actually taken her off somewhere and done something terrible to her. This would have to mean, though, that this random assailant had gone to the trouble of cleaning the car top to bottom, including shampooing the carpets, which is definitely not the norm for this kind of random crime of opportunity. And even more odd was that when Patty's family went to check out the area where her minivan had been found, not only were there no signs of a struggle like scuff marks or drag marks in the dirt, but there were also no signs that Patty had ever experienced a tyre blowout in the first place. If Patty's tyre had been punctured while she was driving, there should have been marks on the road from her swerving. There should have been parts of the tyre itself littered around, but there was none of this because the flat tyre was completely intact and in one piece. So working on a hunch, the family reinflated the flat tyre and they were shocked to find that the tyre held air just fine. There was no puncture anywhere. So this meant that Patty had never experienced a tyre blowout. It meant instead that someone had intentionally deflated that tyre while the car was already on the side of the road to make it look like that was the case. What the family found most alarming, though, this family that had had concerns about JR's treatment of Patty for years, was what Patty's boss had to say about how JR handled the news of him finding the minivan. He said that, of course, he had tried to call Patty first, but when she hadn't answered, he had then gone and called JR, expecting him to drop everything, come and get the van and raise the alarm because something was clearly wrong. But to his surprise, JR refused to even make the trip out, instead asking if he could meet him halfway to give him the keys because he was busy. Yeah, so JR's estranged wife, the mother of his 3 children, was missing and her car had been found abandoned on the side of the road. But JR told Patty's boss that he was busy filing for divorce. JR later tried to defend himself and say that this wasn't what it seemed because, I guess some people might see a husband filing for divorce literally one day after his wife went missing as pretty suspicious. But no, JR said that he didn't really want the divorce, just the opposite. He wanted to serve Patty the papers to shock her into her senses and so that she would leave her new boyfriend and run back into his arms and they could get back together. He's a real planner, that JR. Patty's boss also told the family that once he put a spare tyre on the van and got in to drive it to the office, he found it strange that he hadn't had to adjust the seat or the mirrors, even though he was significantly taller than Patty. So it still hadn't been a full 72 hours since Patty had gone missing, but her cousin called the police back again anyway and told them about the minivan and the tyre, and they decided this was enough for them to get involved and start investigating. And their first move was to go check out the minivan. Like we said, her family had noticed that the car had been thoroughly cleaned, but it wasn't until investigators arrived and took a look that the extent at which this minivan had been cleaned was realized. There was only one set of fingerprints found in that entire car, which were later found to not belong to Patty or any of the kids. And when one of the investigators noticed a small dark stain on the center rear seat, he bent down to have a closer look. And when he stood up, looking at the knees of his trousers, it was clear that not only were the carpets damp, but the water itself had a reddish brown tinge to it, a clear signal that there was blood present, more of which was found in the sliding door of the van as well. This presence of blood was quickly confirmed via lab testing and samples were sent off for DNA testing. So now convinced that Patty had been the victim of foul play, police's next move was to search the family home, the last place that Patty had been seen alive. For this, they needed to contact JR and get his permission because his name was still on all of the paperwork. But this was easily done because the very night that Patty went missing, JR had moved out of his apartment in San Antonio and back in to the family home in Lavernia. He had actually even called a locksmith that night after Patty left and had the locks changed. Like, he really settled on in. Now, obviously, there were Patty and JR's 3 kids living in the house. So on one hand, it just made sense for JR to move in, right? Aside from just making things as easy as possible on these poor kids missing their mother. I don't know how big JR's apartment was, but I doubt there would have been room for all three kids to just move in. But it would come out later that on the 13th of December, so weeks before Christmas, JR had notified management at his apartment that he would need to end his lease early as he would be moving out by the end of the month. Now, the reason he gave management was that he had experienced a, quote, life-threatening occurrence in the parking lot of the apartment building, but the date he gave his notice, the 13th of December, might sound familiar because it's the exact day that JR found out about Patty and Gary being seen together at Dairy Queen. Coincidence? Or had finding out that Patty had moved on with someone new tipped JR over the edge and he decided then and there that he was moving back into that house no matter what? And so on the 29th of December, 4 days after Patty went missing, JR agreed to let investigators search the house. And what they found painted a very disturbing picture of what had happened that Christmas day. Police started the search in Patty's bedroom, where JR said she had spent most of the day crying. And using luminol testing, they found traces of blood on the walls and floor of Patty's bedroom, in Patty's closet, and in the master bathroom on the floor and in the bathtub. The luminol testing also showed that a pretty extensive cleanup had taken place there. There were swipe marks from cleaning products all over the place, and more traces of blood were found on a mop and bucket found in the garage. While all of this testing was taking place, both JR and his sister Marilyn were allowed to be present in the home, and Marilyn was on a mission. She hovered over investigators and pestered them with questions constantly, asking them what they were doing, what they were looking for, and when she overheard one of them say that they had found blood, she piped up and said that it was her blood, that she had cut herself by accident and bled everywhere and used the master bathroom to clean herself up. Apparently, Marilyn was so disruptive in hampering the investigation process that investigators gave up and left and then came back the next day instead. But why was she even allowed to be there in the first place, right? Patty had been missing for nearly a whole week now, and blood had been found in both her car and in her home. The logical conclusion, of course, was that something terrible had happened to her in that house, and then her car had been used to transport her while she was either A, still alive and heavily bleeding, or B, more likely, already dead. And yet, the Vaughan family home was never taped off or secured as a crime scene, apparently because this was Texas and there was no body. I only learned this while researching this case, and things might have changed over the years, but up until this point in time, only 2 murder convictions had ever been secured in Texas without a body. So JR and the kids were allowed to remain living in that house throughout the investigation, contaminating any evidence that might have been present. And although JR had originally been semi-cooperative with the investigation, not long after agreeing to allow police to search the house, he started to shut down. He no-showed for a polygraph test, he lawyered up, and he refused to speak with the police or allow them to speak with the children. Police ended up having to obtain a warrant for blood samples from both JR himself and the children to compare against the blood that they had found in the car and the house. And this warrant actually stated that there was enough evidence that had been found to believe that a murder had been committed in that house. But again, this was Texas. It was like no body, no crime. DNA testing did eventually confirm that Justice suspected the blood found in the car and in the home was Patty's. But even before these DNA results came in, Patty's family were already convinced that she was no longer alive. They just knew that there was no way she would have voluntarily abandoned her 3 children on Christmas night and then just never come home. She would never do that to them. Also, Jeannie said that basically every fight she witnessed while living with JR and Patty. When things had gotten intense, JR would take the spark plugs out of Patty's car so that she had no option to leave the house. But even so, the family had been out searching for Patty from the day she went missing. Like, even before police got involved, they were out there searching the area around where her minivan had been found with the help of a ton of volunteers from the local community. Once police did get involved, there was light aircraft brought in, as well as mounted patrols and bloodhounds. And these bloodhounds actually led them to a pond that was close to where the minivan had been found. And this pond was subsequently dragged, but all of these searches turned up no trace of Patty or anything belonging to her. They never even found her purse that JR said she had taken with her or her car keys. There was just nothing. As well as being out there actively searching for Patty, her family knew that the more people who knew she was missing and were looking for her, the better. So very early on, they reached out to the media, and several national networks did come out to cover the case. Patty's sister and her cousin were giving interviews in front of her minivan and everything, but little, if any, of these interviews actually aired. And over the period of just a day or two, the news crews packed up their gear and left to cover a much bigger story that was breaking halfway across the country in Boulder, Colorado. Because someone else had gone missing that Christmas, 6-year-old beauty pageant queen Jonbenet Ramsay. And anyone familiar with the Jonbenet case will know that the day after Christmas, the same day that Patty's van was found abandoned on the side of the road, Jonbenet's body was tragically discovered in the basement of her own family home. It goes without saying that Jonbenet's case is quite literally one of the most famous unsolved cases in the world, and Patty's family have stated multiple times that they of course do not begrudge the amount of media attention that Jonbenet's case received, but as a direct result, Patty's case, which was relatively big news in Texas, didn't receive any real media attention until that Disappeared episode I mentioned earlier, which aired in 2011. Back to JR, he did not take part in any of these searches for Patty. Not even once. Patty's aunt said that one day she dropped off flyers for him and the kids to hand out, and when she dropped by a few days later to grab some of Patty's things for the search dogs to get a scent of, the flyers were sat right there, exactly where she left them, untouched. And there are a couple of different ways you could look at this. I mean, Patty and JR were estranged. JR said that they had spent all of Christmas Day fighting, and he was probably holding a massive grudge, but this was still the mother of his 3 children, and he just seemed to have no interest whatsoever in finding her. It's been said that JR was actually advised to stay away from the searches by one of his buddies in the sheriff's department, because remember, JR was well connected in town. Of course he had friends in the sheriff's office, and apparently this friend told him that if anything was found in the searches, the last thing JR wanted was for his fingerprints or DNA to be found on it. So the best thing for him to do was to stay away. Does that guy not sound like a really great friend? Like, not a great police officer, but a great friend. And I know everything is looking like ridiculously bad for JR right now, but I imagine some of you are sat there like, yeah, but what about Gary? Because as Patty's new boyfriend, of course, Gary was investigated. And during an interview, he actually admitted that he and his sister were out driving on Christmas Day, and he had asked that she drive past Patty's house. And the two of them had seen Patty's minivan and JR's truck in the driveway and said that the kids were playing out the front. And this kind of struck investigators as a little bit of a red flag. What if Gary was jealous about Patty spending Christmas Day with JR, her estranged husband, instead of with him? And what if JR was right? Patty had stormed out and driven to Gary's house that night, having no idea how angry he was, and they had argued and things had just gotten out of control. This was a teensy bit of a stretch though, seeing as Patty and Gary had only been seeing each other for a couple of weeks, hardly enough time to build up enough jealousy in Gary that he would want to murder her. And Gary's alibi was airtight for Christmas Day and evening. He had been with his sister when he admitted to driving past the house, and the rest of the day he had been with his family and had only been out of everyone's sight long enough to go to the bathroom. Gary also proved to be pretty much the polar opposite of JR when it came to how he handled himself in the investigation. When he found out that Patty was missing, one of the first things Gary did was to march himself down to the station and request a polygraph test, because he knew, being Patty's new boyfriend, that he would be a person of interest, and he wanted to make sure that the time spent investigating him as a suspect was as little as possible so that investigators would be free to find out what had really happened to Patty. Gary passed the polygraph with flying colours, and unlike JR, who never went out searching for Patty, Gary was there from the get-go, right by the family's side at nearly every single search, assisting in every way he could. Sadly though, Gary passed away during the investigation in an incredibly tragic car crash that also took the lives of his children, and as a result, police were never able to officially rule him out as a suspect. Before long, it was February 1997, and Patty's family were beyond frustrated. Patty had been missing for nearly 2 months, and none of the near daily searches they had been running had turned up anything of note. And despite having suspected JR of being responsible for Patty's disappearance pretty much from the moment they found out she was missing, and seeing all of the evidence mounting against him, it was just infuriating to them that nothing had happened. Jeannie said that police originally told them that if the blood in the car and home were found to be Patty's, then JR would be arrested, but this had never happened. And now they were being told that there was not enough evidence against JR, and with Gary never being ruled out as a suspect, there was enough reasonable doubt that meant that if JR was arrested, there was little chance of getting him convicted at all. This was apparently all too much for Patty's mum, and at about 3 a.m. on the 10th of February, she went to the Vaughan house where JR and the kids were sleeping, and she attacked JR using a baseball bat. She was arrested and charged with burglary and assault with a deadly weapon, but it sounds like an arrangement was made between the family and JR, and these charges were later dropped. In May that same year, 1997, the Wilson County Sheriff's Office and the Texas Rangers turned up with cadaver dogs and a ground-penetrating radar to search the construction site of an elementary school in Pleasanton, Texas, which JR's construction company had the contract for. This search was brought on by tips from what sounds like JR's own employees, who said that around Christmas the previous year, when Patty disappeared, JR had been on the site and had personally assigned himself the task of pouring concrete, something that usually, as the head honcho of the company, would be well out of his job description. You know, usually he was the guy supervising the guy pouring concrete. Now, the record showed that JR had been pouring concrete on the 21st of December, days before Patty went missing, but authorities decided to go ahead with the search anyway, working on the idea that maybe the records had been falsified. Furthermore, there had been other tips that had come in that towards the end of December, there had been a foul smell at the work site that was so bad that it attracted vultures. And JR had gotten a huge big industrial fan and plopped it in front of a barrel of diesel to try and mask the smell with the scent of diesel instead. But despite investigators being so sure that they were onto something, although they reported a couple of anomalies in the concrete, there wasn't anything conclusive enough to justify further searches. And Patty's family were there like, yeah, JR would have known that they wouldn't tear up a multi-million-dollar school to look for one body. And so it would have been the perfect place to hide Patty. And they went back in 2001 with their own private investigators and their own equipment, and they too found anomalies in the concrete, but were not permitted to pursue it any further. In 2005, 9 years after Patty went missing, JR filed to have her declared legally dead. by now he had long cut off ties with Patty's family. So they had lost not only Patty herself, but also her 3 children who they hadn't been allowed to see or speak to in years. And you better believe that Patty's family were livid. Having Patty legally declared dead would mean that JR would be allowed to claim her life insurance. And so they filed a civil wrongful death lawsuit against him. But they were worried that this legal battle would have a negative impact on the children, and so they backed down. And eventually a judge ruled that JR could go and claim Patty's death certificate, but rather than him getting the life insurance, it would be deposited into a trust fund for the children. And since then, JR, I believe, has remarried and has also moved to Colorado and is apparently living under a totally different name. Patty's case, as I said at the start of this video, has remained unsolved for all of these years, but there has been a couple of updates here and there over the years. In 2006, police searched a property in Pleasanton after the owner told authorities that JR had worked there in the past and had dug a pit there in December 1996, the same month that Patty went missing. However, the property was right next to a cemetery and cadaver dogs were unable to pick up any scent and nothing of interest was found. In 2008, it was revealed by police that in Patty's car, they had found a pile of men's clothing, including a red jumpsuit, the kind that would usually be worn by a mechanic or a plumber. And this jumpsuit had the initials JM in white on the back. Yeah, JM, not JR. And they made a call out for anyone that would have any information about who this jumpsuit might have belonged to come forward. But this didn't really go anywhere. And over the years, there's been speculations that the jumpsuit was just a red herring that was planted in the minivan to throw investigators off the trail, probably by the same person who cleaned the van top to bottom and intentionally let down the tire. It was also never revealed whether any DNA had been found on the jumpsuit, but police did reveal that while JR was still their prime suspect, they had found evidence that led them to believe that no less than 3 of JR's family members and or friends had assisted in the cleanup after the murder and helped dispose of Patty's body. In 2012, a few years later, police revealed that when retesting undisclosed items that had also been found in the minivan using more current DNA technology, they were very surprised to find DNA from a female not related to Patty, which supported what they had always suspected about other people being involved, if not in the disappearance itself, then at least in the cover-up efforts. The Bexar County Sheriff's Office, who had now taken over the case, even said that based on other information they had, they suspected they knew who the female was, but in order to obtain DNA from this person, they needed probable cause. In 2014, police finally searched the backyard of the Vaughan family home in Lavernia. I know, only nearly 20 years after Patty disappeared, despite a tip they had gotten back in 96 from a neighbour who said that she heard someone digging in that backyard on Christmas night and the following day, like for 2 nights straight, just constant digging. And there's several reasons why it took so long for this search to take place. Firstly, the Vaughan house was actually on the county line, which resulted in Patty's case being bounced back and forth between the Wilson County Police and the Bexar County Police. And then once they finally sorted themselves out, JR, of course, straight up said no when they asked to search the backyard. And then the new owners that moved in would also not allow police to search the yard, saying that they wanted nothing to do with the case. Like, can you imagine? For years, that backyard was where Patty's family believed that her body had been buried, and these people refused to let them search it. So it wasn't until these people moved in 2014 that the DA's office finally got permission and funded the search. Unfortunately, though, after this huge lead up, the search turned up nothing. There are rumors that it wasn't actually the most thorough search. There's quotes from the DA's office that they were just there to squash rumors, and Patty's cousin said that they failed to search either a septic tank or a rubbish pit in the backyard, which was one of the main places that they thought JR might have hidden Patty's body. It seems like the last big update was in 2016 when police revealed that they received a suitcase full of audio recordings of Patty's phone calls from the 2 weeks before she went missing that was found and handed in 20 years later. And the last recording was from Christmas Day, 1996, the day Patty went missing, which to me sounds like a huge breakthrough. But there's literally no other information I could find out about these tapes other than Patty's sister Jeannie saying in an interview that the tapes were recorded by JR. So it seems like either there was something big on those tapes and police are choosing to remain very tight-lipped about it, or the recordings didn't advance the investigation any further. Other than showing that JR was even more dodgy than we all thought and was recording his estranged wife's phone calls without her knowledge or consent. Patty's family have said that they just want to lay Patty to rest, even more than they want justice. Like, they're religious folk. They're leaving the justice up to the big guy. They just want to have some peace for Patty and to give her the proper burial that she deserves. They call the Bexar County, Wilson County, and Texas Rangers all at least once every month or two asking if there's any new leads. And all of these departments basically say the same thing, that they will not pursue Patty's case any further unless new evidence comes to light. Patty Vaughan was 32 years old when she went missing 25 years ago. If she was still alive today, she would be 57 years old. At the time of her disappearance, it's believed she was wearing a cream-coloured blouse, black slacks, and a necklace with a heart-shaped diamond pendant. And that brings us to final thoughts. Like I warned you guys at the beginning, there is not a whole lot of mystery when it comes to this case, right? It's pretty straightforward and hard to believe that it's gone unsolved for 25 years. There's still always hope. Last week we spoke about the Shani Warren case, which is just getting solved now, 35 years after she was murdered. And so there's never not hope. And honestly, I am hopeful in this case that it will get solved in the near future. I am very interested about those audio tapes, not just because of what's on them, but also because of the timeline, because everything seems to come down to the 13th of December. That's when JR found out about Gary, when he gave his notice about breaking lease at his apartment building as well. And if JR had been recording Patty's phone calls for the last 2 weeks, that would once again take us back to around the 13th of December. I just don't understand what JR would have been hoping to achieve by recording Patty's phone calls. Her family say that he had threatened Patty that if they did end up getting divorced, he would fight her for full custody. So maybe he was just trying to get some dirt on her that he would be able to use against her in court. Something I haven't mentioned yet is that Jeannie also said in an interview that there was this calendar found in JR's apartment with what sounds like some kind of rambling countdown to Christmas. It was kind of hard to understand, but it sounds like he had written some kind of plan of attack along the lines of 1, change mind, 2, get kids, 3, Gary, and then just the word Christmas written over and over and over again. So I don't know, was this whole thing premeditated, or was JR just trying everything in his power to get back with Patty, and then when he realized that it wasn't going to happen, he flew off the handle? Patty's children were 9, 7, and 6 when she went missing, but today they are of course full-grown adults, and they still to this day have no contact with Patty's side of the family. But the family does hope that one day, if they do know anything about what happened, they will feel comfortable enough to come forward. I mean, we know that they were present in the house that day that Patty went missing, but we have no idea what they've been through all of these years, plus what JR might have told them about what happened to their mother. You know, in the end, he is their father and the only parent they have left. I just can't imagine being in their shoes. But as usual, I would love to hear your guys' thoughts on this case, even if it's just to say that you too are frustrated AF that it's still unsolved. This hangout does not have to end here right now. We can all just meet up in the comments to debrief and share our thoughts. Maybe even hazard a guess as to who the female DNA that was found in Patty's van belonged to, because I know I definitely have a suspect in mind. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it and you want to support our safe little space here, all you have to do is give this video a like, make sure we're subscribed so that we're best friends forever and ever and ever, and leave a comment below. Once again, I wish you all a huge, happy and safe holiday season. Hug your loved ones extra tight tonight. Tell them you love them, and spare a thought for Patty and her family. Lily, you gonna come say bye? Or are you dead from heat stroke? You are still alive. Oh, it's a hard life, isn't it? Yeah. When she's up here like this, she likes watching herself in the screen. It's so funny. You know you're pretty, don't you? Lily and I love you guys so much. Thank you so much for spending this time with us, and we will be counting down the hours until we see you in the next one. Bye.